And now we talk about psychedelic prohibition. As I've said before, in '62, Congress started putting restrictions on LSD. This looks like something, that they should, control a little bit. In 1966, Senate hearings were actually held, and as a result of those, the FDA instituted further restrictions on use and research with LSD. And in that same year, LSD was made illegal in California. In '68, they stiffened penalties for having LSD, using LSD. And in 1970, that saw the birth of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, the Part 2 of which was the Controlled Substances Act, and the schedule system, which you all, well, most of you probably know about, Schedule 1 through 5. Schedule 1 being substances that have no therapeutic or research potential, and without much thought, psychedelics and marijuana were put into Schedule 1. It seems to me that a lot of the decision-making around that time was based on hysteria and fear rather than looking at the available scientific evidence, which of course was still preliminary at that time. But to sort of just take a hatchet to all the work that was going on in research circles, it seemed a little bit like an overreaction, at least in hindsight and from my perspective. Maybe we can talk about that later. So between 1970 and 1990, most legitimate work with psychedelics was done as bench work and as animal research. And like I said, a lot of the decision making, a lot of the thinking at the time was based on fear and some irrationality. And as a result, there were several myths regarding LSD use and LSD and health. Things like chromosome damage. This hit the front pages when a study suggested that there might be a link between LSD and chromosome damage. All over the media, that LSD causes irreversible damage to people's genome. 1 or 2 years later, more detailed, better designed studies came out and showed almost indisputably that LSD was not responsible for chromosome damage, and that wasn't reported nearly as much as the initial report that LSD was responsible. So chromosome damage doesn't happen. Same thing with leukemia. There was at one point a link hypothesized between certain kinds of leukemia and LSD. That again never really happened, wasn't true. There was a story out, an urban myth, about two young college students who took LSD and then stared at the sun until they went blind. I think it was sometime in the mid-'70s that a politician in Pennsylvania came clean and said that he made that story up to scare kids out of not doing drugs. So again, not true. I think we've all, or most of us, have heard the story about children's tattoos being laced with LSD, so be careful when you go out on Halloween, and if anybody gives you one of those lick 'em stick 'em tattoos, you better throw it away. Once again, there's been not one reported incidence of this ever happening. And finally, there's rumors, particularly among college students, that strychnine is somehow involved in the manufacture of LSD, that it's either required to kick LSD into your system or that it's needed to keep LSD sticking to the blotter paper. There was one report of a batch of LSD being adulterated with strychnine, but that was powdered LSD. There's never been a case of blotter acid being contaminated with strychnine. So again, that's something of an urban myth amongst users. Oh. How do I get back to that? There we go. For those of you who can't read it says, "Sorry, son, but for you to understand what happened, you have to first understand that back in the '60s we were all taking a lot of drugs." So now you know that's not true. So now we'll talk about some of the more recent work that's been done. Psychedelic research is gradually coming back. In Switzerland, between '88 and '93, Bloch et al. Did a retrospective study with 171 subjects looking at MDMA and LSD-assisted psychotherapy because these are legal modalities of treatment in that country. In 1996, Spitzer looked at the cognitive effects of psilocybin and found that it increased indirect semantic priming. In '98, in Germany, Hermle et al. Looked at blood flow and cerebral laterality with mescaline. And finally, in '99, Guzoulis, Mayfrank et al. Looked at the neurometabolic effects of psilocybin and some other drugs in healthy volunteers. There are currently projects in progress or under development. Kurland at Baltimore is looking at using LSD in the treatment of cancer patients. This project is currently on hold at the FDA. Matthew in Durham is looking at using mescaline in healthy human volunteers and examining religious experiences. Charles Grobe at UCSD just got approval for using psilocybin in the terminally ill. Vollenweider in Switzerland is doing basic dose-response safety studies with psilocybin, and Torsten Passy and others in Germany are doing a study using healthy physician volunteers and looking at some of the neuropsychological and neurobehavior effects of psilocybin. The church was formed in 1930. There were at least 12 states that outlawed the use of peyote. Across the ocean in Italy in 1931, a guy named Dr. Baroni started using mescaline as an adjunct to psychotherapy. 1953 and 54 saw the publication of Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, which of course is Aldous Huxley's first-person account of using mescaline, and he gives some pretty detailed descriptions of his experience. It's a good read if you have some time. In 1960, the federal government gave Native Americans legal access to peyote, which was good because in '67 they banned everybody else from using it. The use of the ergolines now, mainly because this is the only example of hallucinogens being used ritually in the ancestors of Western European civilization. Starting in 1500 BC and lasting until about 300 AD, when again the Christians started getting more heavily involved in Roman politics, there was a ceremony called the Eleusinian Mysteries. This was an annual celebration to honor the goddess Demeter, who was the goddess of the fields and of grain. There was a pretty exclusive invitation list in its 1800 years of life. Attendees at this celebration included people like Homer, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, Pindar, and Aeschylus. And they would get together for 2 or 3 days and they'd drink something called kykeon, which, judging from what has been written about this and what has been described, was probably a grain-based brew whose hallucinogenic properties were derived from rye ergot fungus. Now we hop ahead a few hundred years to 1943, when a chemist named Albert Hofmann was synthesizing rye ergot derivatives for use in medicine. On April 16th, he accidentally ingested LSD-25, an agent he developed as a blood stimulant for Sandoz. 3 days later, he purposefully ingested LSD, about 250 micrograms. And again, he wrote a really nice account. He went for a bike ride. He rode his bike from like work to home, and to him it took about 5 years to get there. Again, really entertaining reading. So it didn't take too long for the CIA over here in the US to find out that LSD was around and that it had some pretty profound effects on the human mind. So in 1953, the CIA started their MK Ultra experiments. Now, these were not experiments in the usual sense that we think of them these days, because these days, we insist on these things like consent to participate in experiments. The CIA was going around and giving people LSD without their knowledge. That actually resulted in 1 or 2 suicides. So finally, in '63, that kind of stuff was shut down. While the CIA was goofing around, Tim Leary started some more legitimate research work at Harvard.